Hello and welcome to YAGR. This is our final verdict on Sundered by Thunder Lotus Games. Our playthrough team has spent roughly 23 hours in-game, achieving a 98% completion rating, which includes all primary bosses and story elements. I'd like to also note that there are timestamps in the description to jump to specific components of the review if there are only a limited number of things you're interested in hearing about. So please feel free to use those at your own discretion. Also, a disclaimer, this video includes a couple mini-boss fights as well as late-game abilities to be showcased, so please be aware of that. Moving on to the actual review, Thunder Lotus Games did something interesting. They made a very challenging game. And again, I'd like to remind everyone, the playthrough team and I played this on normal difficulty, so we didn't expect the degree of frustration that we most certainly felt playing through this game, particularly in end or late game. First, I'd like to discuss the abilities, specifically combat. We'll be referencing combat here. In combat, one of our initial concerns was it felt a little repetitive, and your toolbox wasn't big enough to meet all of the challenges the way you'd like. The toolbox certainly expanded as you evolved your abilities and explored the map and got practice with the game. Your toolbox of combat abilities most definitely exponentially expanded. However, it still felt fairly repetitive by the end of the game. It felt like I was just spamming the attack button, throwing in some heavy attacks, and mixing aerial and ground combat. But nothing I felt I was doing felt different in the first 10 hours of gameplay than the last 10 hours of gameplay. It just felt like I could move around a little bit differently. That's about it. So that's the first complaint about combat. Secondly, and without spoiling anything, later in the game, part of the ending, it felt extremely unfair because what I was fighting didn't abide by all of the rules that were applied to myself as the player the whole game. I understand that in order to make a challenge, enemies have their own essentially special rule set, but this was extremely frustrating because of the way it was employed. It provided a ridiculous level of difficulty that the rest of the game hadn't prepared me for, and that remains true for reaching late and end game in Sundered, is the expectation management from playing through the game and then reaching kind of the ending section of it, if you will. The expectations were completely different on the player. You had been doing things a certain way for the first half of the game or the first two-thirds of the game, and then in the last third, half of, well, I wouldn't say half, some of the tools that you had been using the entire time were no longer safe or good enough to use. And that felt terrible to have tools taken away from me. It added to the frustration that I felt throughout the game, and that's going to be a theme you'll see in this final verdict, is frustration. What I mean by having tools taken away is the map and level design, which is what we'll talk about next, essentially made it impossible for you to use one or two specific moves in your kit, because many of the levels later in the game have essentially no floor to land on, and they just lead into this dark fog that was never explained really what it was in the plot, and it more or less kills you within a couple seconds if you fall completely into it, and I think I escaped it once in my entire gameplay. That means you have to be very careful when you use certain abilities, and when you're moving around a lot in the middle of the air, it's very easy to accidentally input the commands for that ability. I understand this game demands preciseness from the player, and it never hid that from me as the player. It always felt like I needed to be very specific and precise, but mistakes are bound to happen, and when they happen repeatedly and get you killed repeatedly, particularly in a boss fight, that you have to run through a bunch of crap to get to, it is so frustrating to just instantly die because of a misinputted control when you're trying to deal with so much other stuff. Do they need to cater to the player in that regard? Absolutely not. Could they have done something because there are other factors in this game that are extremely frustrating by that point? Absolutely they could have. But they chose not to. It's probably an intentional design choice, but that doesn't change the degree of frustration that players reach when they get there. So, That is pretty much what I have to say negatively about the combat. Otherwise, it feels good from a graphic and audio standpoint. The combat is great. Everything sounds impactful. Everything sounds exciting, from enemy sound clips and enemy graphics to the players' sound clips and graphics when they do any kind of platforming or combat. Sounds good, looks good, feels great. Outside of having tools stolen from you from map design, as well as enemies not playing by your rules. Moving on to the map and level design that I had mentioned before, there is a disgusting number of map hazards, and frankly, through most of the game, I felt like the map was a tougher enemy than everything else I had fought. This game is very much designed around platforming, so that may not be a particular issue, and it might have been expected to a degree, but the sheer level of ridiculousness that the map can provide is so frustrating. When you're trying to fight a boss or trying to fight a horde of enemies and you end up dying because you keep hitting the same spikes that you can't see because it's hidden behind an enemy or behind a component of foreground, it feels terrible. How am I supposed to play around that if it's literally hidden from me from a visual aspect? Not only that, but there's just hundreds of locations in a particular map where I can be impacted by the terrain hazards. I understand the need for them. I think it was a nice little add, and it certainly speaks to the platforming aspect of the game, but the sheer volume of them in the middle of the most chaotic combat I've experienced in a Metroidvania game felt extremely unfair, and again, filled me with this frustration. I don't think it was necessary to go quite as overboard with that, and I frankly would have rather seen maybe one or two new enemy types that provided a challenge outside of the map killing me. It felt pretty unsatisfying when it happened. Even if I'm not fighting anything and I'm just running through a zone, sometimes I'll end up bumping into it because it's hidden off screen in an area I have to jump through. And while it may not impact my health and the shield just absorbs it or something like that, it still makes me go, really? Did you have to put that there? That was kind of cheap. So, I don't know. I feel like they went a little overboard with it. Feel free to disagree with me on that point. I'm certain that some people are going to have more issues with it than others. But outside of that, the map design is good. Outside of it having probably too many traps or hazards on it, and also stealing away a couple moves from your toolbox depending on what region you're in, the map design is good. There's plenty of places to jump, there's lots of places to manipulate and move around when in combat or just trying to traverse the level, and I think that's good. And also there's essentially three primary regions which all feel like completely different maps aesthetically, as well as through the theme of the enemies you fight, and even the natural hazards do at least look different, and some of them feel different from region to region. So I think the map design from a non-mechanical perspective is great, and from a mechanical perspective was a little overdone. It's not necessary to make the map its own separate enemy to the degree that they have done. That goes over map and level design as well as combat, so we're going to go through platforming mechanics, our final verdict on that. Overall, feels really good. As you get new abilities, they most certainly increase your platforming ability, and it feels like that's where the progression was mostly focused when it came to abilities and their upgrades. Makes a lot of sense for a Metroidvania game. I don't think that's out of character, and they did a great job with that. Outside of the grappling hook, which I've already discussed in my deep dive. I will not go into as much detail, but it should be noted, the grappling hook, because it is so important late game when it comes to defeating bosses and traversing the entire level region, should have been worked on and cleaned up a little bit more. There should have been a bit more of a hierarchy and target prioritization. There should have been an increase or maybe a contextual based range or something that could indicate better what you're going to target when you use the ability, and none of that was provided. The ability gets a little better when you upgrade it, but it's still really, really frustrating to use. I think that is by far and large the weakest point of the game is that mechanic alone. Outside of all of my other complaints, I think that should have been worked on. It is integral to completing multiple boss fights as well as your survival through any given level. Other than that, platforming feels good. I never feel like I don't have any options to move about. So I think mechanically it's great outside of the grappling hook. I think visually, graphically, audibly, it's excellent. It feels good. I love doing it. Moving and jumping around the level is some of the most fun I have in the game sometimes. So overall, platforming mechanics are great, but the integral component that they placed inside of the platforming and mobility mechanics of the grappling hook is not good enough. It's not up to snuff, in my opinion. Moving on to bosses, without any spoilers, of course. The bosses felt epic. They felt like they were different, and they certainly felt like the challenge walls that a game deserves. That's what bosses are supposed to be. You should have to fight a boss more than once. There's supposed to be a skill and ability check. They're not supposed to be something that just falls over when you look at it. And Sundered, you made great bosses. They look and feel thematically appropriate and different from most everything else you deal with in the game. Mechanically, what the bosses actually do is really, really impressive and really cool. I loved seeing it, I loved playing against it, and I loved learning to play around it. However, some of the scenarios felt pretty damn unfair. And most of that is because not only is the boss working against you, but even the boss zones have map hazards that can really screw you over. And in fact, one of the bosses is designed around a map hazard becoming increasingly more difficult for you to deal with, on top of his essentially screen spanning attacks. So yes, it was extremely challenging, but it felt amazing when I beat it. I loved that feeling of beating it, but the amount of frustration it took to deal with some of the bosses and the sheer amount of dead time or difficulty to just get to the boss was super frustrating. So by the time I got to the boss, I was already frustrated, which is no doubt going to impact your gameplay in a high intensity scenario. So those two things playing off of each other, I feel added an extra degree of difficulty that was unnecessary. Maybe make it easier to get to the bosses after you've gotten there once, or ease up on the terrain being such a huge factor in boss fights for future design choices and things like that. But otherwise, the bosses were super cool. They were thematically cool to look at and hear and deal with, but the frustration of getting to the boss was largely unnecessary when it takes you 7, 8, 9 times to try and beat a boss, and the struggle to just get to the boss can be its own challenge, and trying to save your resources by the time you get there. Overall, the bosses were really cool, though. I love the bosses. I thought it was exciting to see a different, essentially, sheer scale of dealing with the boss compared to dealing with everything else, and that was intriguing to me. I hadn't really seen that before in a game. So I suppose it's time to move on to the wrap-up or summary here. Overall, Sundered, for the price that they have sold it for, of I believe roughly $18, somewhere between $15 and $20, overall, Sundered is absolutely worth that price. I would have paid a little more for it, but I'm very happy they didn't try to charge a full $60 for it, because it's not worth $60. I'd say maybe $30 to $40 is what they could have gone up to, but I'm glad they didn't, because that makes it a reasonable purchase. I think for the price it is at now, if you like this kind of game, it's worth a pickup. If you're on the fence about it, maybe wait for a sale, because the degree of frustration that it's going to provide you is going to feel very difficult to justify if you're not into this kind of game. But you do essentially get 3 effective different playthroughs out of it, because evolving your abilities in one way or another, or choosing not to, I believe, or mixing and matching, results in different actual endings, which is really cool. And I loved the ending. I'm not going to spoil it, but I did full corruption, or embrace, I guess is what they call it, and the ending was badass. I loved it. It didn't really tell me anything more about the story, and frankly, they could have done more with that, but it felt good. I think the ending was appropriate. I liked it. Overall, the game is solid. I liked it, but the degree of frustration I had to deal with getting through the game was really upsetting. So, when you're looking at whether you want to buy Sundered or not, definitely take that into account. It's not something that I would recommend you pick up and drop everything else you're working on to play. And when I say working on, I specifically refer to working through other games. Because it is something that you do not play all in one sitting. One, it's too long for that, in my opinion. And two, it is too frustrating for that. You will essentially be beating yourself up if you choose to do that. So bear that in mind when you're looking at whether you want to buy Sundered or not. The frustration is definitely a question of worth to the player. Outside of that factor, I think it is a well-crafted game, and certain components of it are near perfect, if not perfect. The art style is truly amazing. I love it, and I expected to love it, especially from a company like Thunder Lotus Games. The audible components of the game are also excellent, from the sound design of the abilities and the music choice and things like that. The plot left me wanting the entire game, and that drove me to play more, but also it was disappointing in the end because I didn't get all of the answers I wanted, and I still didn't really understand everything. I just kind of understood one key component of it. The bosses felt epic and amazing, and there's no serious complaints about that, but the level design needs to be, or should have been, thought through a little bit better, I think, is a safe way to talk about that. The level design overall seems interesting, and I see what they were going for, and I think the concept is great, but the execution was a little excessive in certain areas. That being said, overall the game is good. It's nowhere near perfect, but it is certainly worth the $15 to $20, and I think it's something you should pick up if you're into Metroidvania games. If you're not into Metroidvania games but would like to try Sundered, I would say wait for a sale, wait for it to go down to 10 to 15, because you're not missing out on anything changing to the industry, but it is pretty good. It's very enjoyable to beat and play through. Overall, I hope you enjoyed our review of Sundered. I recommend you go and check out the game, but do it when it's the right time for you. And that pretty much wraps up the final verdict on Sundered. Good, but not worth jumping through hoops to go get. This has been the YAGR team with our final verdict on Sundered. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you online soon.